She found value in the old abandoned roofing tiles from the steelworks and turned it into an income. Heather arrived alone at the steelworks gate that Monday morning, her hands shoved into the pockets of her brown leather apron and her chin lifted like someone who hadn't come to ask for a favor, but to demand what she understood to be rightfully hers, even if that right still needed to be won with words and plenty of firmness. There was no one waiting for her, no sign, no invitation, no indication that that rusty gate and that woman with blonde hair tousled by the cold wind were about to cross paths in a way that neither would ever forget. What she wanted was piled up at the back of the steelworks yard. Hundreds of old metal roofing tiles, rusted at the edges, warped from neglect, which the establishment planned to discard the following week as if they had never been good for anything. To the company, that was trash. To Heather, it was the only way out she had seen after 8 months of trying not to completely sink. 8 months. That was how long it had been since the night Craig packed his suitcase, or rather, his 2 suitcases, and walked out the front door without looking back. No full explanation, not even sitting down at the table to talk like 2 adults who had shared 15 years of life together should. He left a letter on top of the refrigerator, as if hastily scribbled words on a folded piece of paper could account for everything he was leaving behind. Heather read that letter 3 times, standing in the kitchen, and on the 3rd time she folded the paper, put it inside the document drawer, and went to check if Chloe was still asleep. The girl was sleeping, and Heather stood at the door of her daughter's room for about 5 minutes, looking at that shape under the blanket, thinking that the child would wake up the next day believing life was the way it had always been, not knowing that the ground had been pulled out from under everything during the night. There was no money in the account. There was a debt at the bank, 2 overdue bills, and a check that had bounced the previous week. Craig took the car and left the debts. Heather took the debts and kept the daughter. In the first few months she managed as best she could. She did house cleaning, washed clothes for others, sewed school uniforms for a lady in the neighborhood who paid per piece. When the supply cooperative where she had worked for 6 years as a warehouse assistant suddenly shut down, overnight, with a sign on the gate and not even a meeting with the employees, she lost the only registered job she had. It was the hardest blow, not because of the salary itself, though it was missed, but because of the feeling that the ground kept sinking beneath her without her being able to find anywhere to plant her feet. It was on a Thursday afternoon that she rode her bike past the side of the steelworks. She was on her way to Mrs. Martha's house, where she cleaned every week, and the shortest route went by Industrial Warehouse Row on the north side of town. The side gate was open because of a truck that was leaving, and Heather braked her bike without even really realizing she had stopped. She stood there, 1 foot on the ground, looking at the steelworks' inner yard through the gap in the gate. Inside, against the back wall, there was a pile of metal roofing tiles stretching a good 10 meters, corrugated sheets of aged zinc, some bent, others with raised edges, many with dark rust stains. But there was a lot of material there, and Heather, who had spent the last few months learning to look at what others discarded and imagine what it could still become, stood staring for too long. The guard inside the gate noticed she was standing there and walked toward her. "Can I help you?" he asked without hostility. "What are you going to do with those roofing tiles in the back?" She answered with a question. The man looked where she was pointing and shrugged his shoulders. "Throwing them away next week." "Why?" She didn't answer. She nodded in thanks, pedaled away. And she spent the whole night awake staring at the ceiling, doing the math that necessity teaches you to do. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That helps us a lot who are just starting out, now continuing. The next morning, early on a Friday, Heather walked to the corner grocery store and spent about 20 minutes talking to the farmers who stopped by in the early morning for coffee before heading to their farms. She listened. She wasn't selling anything. She wasn't offering anything. She just listened. And what she heard confirmed what she already suspected. Almost everyone had a roof to fix, some shed with a hole, some covering that couldn't take the rain anymore. And almost everyone put it off because the price of new roofing sheets was just too high. That afternoon, she went back to the steelworks, this time through the front gate, with her little notebook in hand, and the denim blouse she saved for occasions that required a slightly more put-together appearance, she asked to speak to the person in charge. The general manager who came to meet her was named Arthur Jenkins, a man in his mid-50s with grey hair combed to the side and a dress shirt buttoned all the way up, despite the heat the afternoon insisted on bringing. He looked at her with an expression Heather knew well, the expression of someone who's already decided they won't have patience for the conversation before even hearing what the other person has to say. "What do you need?" he asked, standing a few feet away. "I want the roofing sheets you're going to throw away," she said, without beating around the bush. He blinked once, just once, as if the answer was so unexpected that his face needed a second to process it. "The sheets in the yard." "That's right." Arthur looked her up and down, at the brown leather apron she had put on over her denim blouse, at the hands holding the little notebook, at the sneakers tied with a double knot because the lace had broken and she hadn't replaced it yet. There was a question behind his eyes that wasn't about the roofing sheets. It was a question about her, about what a woman in that situation could do with 300 and some rusty zinc sheets. "What do you intend to do with those?" he finally asked. She looked at him without flinching. "Do what I need to, so I don't depend on anyone else." The silence that followed lasted about 5 seconds. It could have lasted longer, but Arthur realized she wasn't going to fill that silence with explanations, excuses, or anything to make it easier for him. She just waited. He signed an informal authorization on a sheet of the steelworks letterhead, convinced, as was clear from the smile that slipped out as he scribbled his signature, that she would give up when she realized what she had asked for. There were 342 pieces, according to the steelworks' internal records, heavy, dirty, rusty at the edges, some of them practically unrecognizable as roofing sheets. "There are about 300 and some pieces," he said, handing over the paper. "Heavy? Are you sure?" "I am," she said. And she left with the paper folded inside her little notebook. Only when she turned the corner and was out of sight of the guard did she let out the air all at once, as if she had been holding her breath since she walked through that gate. She leaned against a wall and stood there for a moment, alone on the sidewalk with the afternoon sun hitting her from the side, feeling her legs slightly shaky, not from fear, from relief, and from something she couldn't quite name but that vaguely reminded her of hope. The next problem was the transportation. She didn't have a car, didn't have a truck, didn't have the money to pay for hauling. But she had Mr. George. Mr. George had lived next door to her for over 20 years, a jovial man about 65 years old who had retired from a job in woodworking and since then spent his days tending a small vegetable garden in the backyard and fixing things that neighbors brought him. His pickup truck was old with a rusty body, and the passenger seat had a tear in the leather that had been patched up with silver duct tape, but it ran. And Mr. George, who had seen Heather come to town 15 years ago when she married Craig, who had seen Chloe be born and grow up, and who had pretended not to notice the night Craig left because he understood that nothing was called for in that moment but silence, said yes before she even finished explaining. "But I won't take any money," he said, raising his hand as if she were about to protest. "Then you'll take a home-cooked meal," she replied. "1 week." He thought for about 2 seconds. 2 weeks, he said. "That pot roast with carrots of yours that Chloe won't eat, but that's the best thing I've ever put in my mouth." She laughed. It was the first time she'd truly laughed in weeks, and she noticed it the very moment it happened. A small laugh, but real. It took 3 afternoons of work to haul everything, Mr. George drove the pickup to the back lot of the steelworks, where the same guard let them in with a bored look, and the two of them loaded the tiles one by one onto the truck bed, stacking them carefully so the weight stayed balanced. The tiles were deceptively heavy. They seemed manageable when you picked up the first one, but after half an hour of carrying, the weight built up on your shoulders and back in a way that demanded a toll. Chloe watched from inside the house. Heather noticed her daughter's silhouette at the bedroom window every time the truck came back with another load. The girl didn't come to help, didn't ask anything, just watched. There were 14 years between them, but in that period they were like 2 planets in separate orbits, too close to ignore each other and too far apart to touch. Ever since Craig left, Chloe had closed a door inside herself that Heather hadn't yet found the key to open. The lot next to the house was empty. It belonged to a man named Mr. Henderson, who lived in a neighboring county, and had left the space available indefinitely in exchange for Heather, taking care of the grass and the back area when needed. She used that space to store the tiles, arranging them in piles by size and condition, protecting the best ones under an old tarp she had found folded in the house's own shed. The house's shed was another story. It had been abandoned since Craig left. He had used that space to store tools and equipment he never actually put to use, and when he left, he took some and left others behind. Heather had shut the shed door in the first month and hadn't opened it since. It was one of the places in the house she avoided, without needing to explain why. The work of cleaning and straightening the tiles began the day after the hauling ended. She woke up at 5:30 in the morning, put on her denim shirt and brown leather apron, tied her blonde hair into a hurried bun, and went to the lot next door with a bucket, old rubber gloves, a steel brush, and a mixture of vinegar and water she had read was effective against surface rust in an old magazine she found in a doctor's office waiting room months ago. The process was simple, but time-consuming. Scrub each tile with the brush dipped in the mixture, let it sit for a few minutes, scrub again, rinse with the bucket. For the ones that were dented or had their edges curled up, she used a thick piece of wood and a rubber hammer she had borrowed from Mr. George to pound back into shape what time had warped. They weren't perfect, but they were functional, and there was a difference between a rusty, misshapen tile and a used tile that looked cared for that any buyer would recognize. She worked for 3 hours every morning before heading out to her cleaning gigs. She came back in the afternoon and worked for another 2 hours. On weekends, she worked all day. Mrs. Gladys showed up on the 4th afternoon of work. She lived on the other side, in the house that was flush against the back wall of the lot where the tiles were. A tiny woman about 67, with completely white hair cut short and dark, lively eyes that missed no detail of what went on around her. She had been a seamstress for nearly 40 years, raised 4 kids on her own after her husband got sick early on, and had a reputation in town for being both the most generous and the most straightforward person you could meet. Nothing about her was easy to fool. She showed up with a mug of coffee in her hand and stopped on the other side of the low fence separating the 2 lots, watching Heather work without saying a word for a good long while. "You know you're doing it right, don't you?" she finally said. Heather looked up from the tile she was scrubbing. "I still don't know if it'll work out," she answered honestly. Mrs. Gladys lifted her chin slightly. "That's not the same thing," she said. "Doing it right and it working out are 2 different things. One depends on you, the other doesn't." Heather stared at the woman for a second, then she went back to the tile. "Want some coffee?" Mrs. Gladys asked. "I do," she said. And that was how a friendship began that Heather hadn't sought, but which over time proved to be exactly one of the things she had been missing. On the following Saturday morning, Heather took the first 28 tiles to the flea market that happened on the town square every week. Mr. George helped her set up an improvised display by leaning some pieces against the side of the pickup truck, so that anyone passing by could see the quality of the material. The initial reaction was one of distrust. People stopped, looked, touched the tiles, and asked if they were new. "They're reused," she said, always with the same direct tone. "They were discarded by a steelworks. I cleaned and straightened them. They work just as well as new tiles." Some people walked away without buying. One woman even laughed. But a man named Hank, a farmer about 50, a second-generation rancher with big hands and a worn-out straw hat he wore in any weather, stood examining a tile for a long time, tapping the surface with his knuckles, holding it up to the light, checking the thickness. "And if it bends under the weight?" he asked. Heather took the tile from his hands, placed it on the ground on 2 bricks she had brought just for that purpose, and stood on it with her full weight. The tile didn't give, didn't warp, didn't creak. Hank looked at the ground, then at her, then at the tile. "How much?" he asked. She gave the price. He counted the dollars in his pocket, paused for a second, and bought 12 units. Enough to cover the chicken coop that had been leaking since the last heavy rain. It was the first sale, and Heather stood there after Hank left carrying the tiles to his car, looking at the bills in her hand, and felt something in her chest she couldn't quite describe. It wasn't euphoria, it wasn't relief, it was something more solid than those two. It was the feeling that something had truly begun. That week, the news spread among the farm workers in a way Heather hadn't planned but wasn't surprised by. In the countryside, when someone solves a problem cheaply and efficiently, word travels fast. She started receiving orders via messages, notices at the corner grocery store, and notes left with Mr. George when she wasn't around. An older lady who lived on the farm next to her father's wanted to know if she had enough roof tiles for a porch. A man who raised pigs needed to close the roof of a pigsty that had been exposed since a storm took part of the covering. Chloe noticed the commotion. It was impossible not to notice. Heather's notebook was always on the kitchen table, filled with scribbled names and numbers, and sometimes her cell phone wouldn't stop ringing. The girl watched everything without commenting, with that closed-off expression that had settled on her face since her father left, one Heather still hadn't fully figured out. One Thursday night, as Heather sat at the table trying to organize the week's orders, Chloe passed through the kitchen to get a glass of water and stopped behind her for a second. "You're charging too little for these last ones," she said, without ceremony. Heather looked up from the notebook. "What?" Chloe pointed at one of the lines. "This one from Mr. Harold. You charge 20 per piece, but the other orders are at 22. Did you forget, or was it on purpose?" Heather looked at the note. She had forgotten indeed. "I forgot," she admitted. Chloe left with her glass of water without saying another word. But Heather kept staring at the line her daughter had pointed out for a good while after she left, feeling a strange thing in her chest, a mix of pride and sadness she couldn't quite place. What Chloe didn't know, what Heather had decided she wouldn't know, at least for now, was that part of the money coming in had been used to pay 3 months of overdue school tuition. The school had sent a notice at the beginning of the month saying the situation needed to be resolved by the end of the period. Heather had gone to the office in person, explained the situation with a steady voice and without apologizing, and negotiated a payment plan she had covered with the first sales. Chloe woke up every day unaware that her spot at school had been at risk, and Heather intended to keep it that way. But what she also didn't know, because Chloe kept things to herself too, was that her daughter was going through a tough time at school that went beyond grades. The girl had been good friends with a girl named Tiffany, daughter of the owner of a pharmacy downtown, and they had been inseparable for nearly 2 years. But ever since the situation at Chloe's home had changed, since the car disappeared, since the outings stopped, since she had to stop going to a classmate's birthday party because there was no money for a gift, Tiffany had gradually and cowardly drifted away, the way some friends have of disappearing without ever saying in words what they're doing. The week before, Chloe had come home quieter than usual and stayed in her room straight until dinner. Heather had asked if everything was okay. Chloe said yes, and the two sat at the table eating in silence, separated by a meter of distance and the weight of everything they couldn't say to each other. Mrs. Gladys, who saw more than most people thought a 67-year-old woman standing at the window could see, had spoken to Heather about it one afternoon when they were having coffee on her porch. "That girl's swallowing a lot," Mrs. Gladys said without preamble. Heather looked at her mug. "I know," she said. "You are too." "I know that too." Mrs. Gladys was quiet for a moment, gently rocking in the rocking chair she had bought when she turned 60 and used every day. "Sometimes you need to let the other person see that you're suffering," she said. "Not so someone can fix it, just so you're not alone in it." Heather didn't answer, but that line stayed with her for days, like a small pebble in your shoe that you feel with every step but don't stop to remove. It was in the 3rd week of work that Heather realized for the first time that someone was watching what she was doing in a way that wasn't curiosity. It was interest, the kind of interest that isn't good. Victor Vance had a building materials warehouse on the main street downtown. He was a man of about 55, short and stocky, with the kind of smile that appeared on his lips before it reached his eyes, and sometimes never reached his eyes at all. He had built the business by inheriting the space from his father and expanding it with a mix of hard work and a particular skill for eliminating the competition before it grew big enough to be eliminated. He was known in town, respected by some, feared by others, and avoided by those who had learned the difference between the two. He found out what Heather was doing through a customer who had bought roofing tiles from her and mentioned the matter like he was paying a compliment, without imagining he was lighting a spark in someone who didn't need much to get riled up. Vance went to the steelworks on a Wednesday morning. Heather learned about this because Mr. George, who had driven past the steelworks that morning in his pickup to get a part from a nearby warehouse, recognized Vance's car parked at the entrance. Mr. George knew her well enough to understand that information mattered. Vance's car was there, he said simply when he crossed paths with her early in the afternoon. Heather didn't ask how he knew it mattered. She just nodded in thanks and held that information inside. 2 days later, she got a message by phone. It was the steelworks manager, Arthur Jenkins, asking her to stop by because he needed to review the deal he had made. She held the cell phone in her hand after the call ended, standing in the middle of the lot with a roofing tile in her other hand and the afternoon sun on her back. She stayed like that for a while, a time she couldn't measure. Then she set the tile down carefully, went inside the house, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floor. That night, after Chloe fell asleep, she went out to the backyard and sat on a wooden stool looking at the tiles on the top. The sky was clear, and there was a nearly full moon that cast a cold brightness over the sheets of zinc. She stayed there for a long time, and for the first time since she had started, she cried. Not from discouragement. She knew discouragement, knew how it worked. It was something different. It was anger. A clean, solid anger, the kind that doesn't disappear with crying but sometimes needs crying to find its proper shape. She didn't hear the kitchen door open behind her. She only noticed Chloe's presence when the girl sat on the ground next to the stool, cross-legged, without saying a word. Her daughter didn't ask what had happened. She didn't try to console her, didn't say anything like it was all going to be okay. She just stayed there, outside, with her mother, in the silence of that moonlit night. That silence lasted a long time, and inside it, there was a lot of unspoken accumulation. Months of distance, of closed doors, of short answers, of dinners without conversation. But there was also, buried deep in all of that, something that was still intact between them. Something neither of them knew how to name yet, but that was there. "What happened?" Chloe asked finally, in a low voice. Heather explained the manager's message. Not everything, not the details about Vance, but enough for her daughter to understand that someone wanted to undo what she had built. Chloe listened. She was quiet for a moment. "And you're going to let it happen," she said. Heather looked at her daughter. "No," she said. Chloe nodded slightly, as if that was the answer she expected, and got up from the floor. "Then go to bed," she said. "Tomorrow, you'll go there." And she went inside. Heather stayed a little longer in the yard, alone. But the anger had settled into a more useful form. It had turned into determination. The next morning she went personally to the steelworks. She didn't go empty-handed. She brought the little notebook with all the sales recorded, full name of the buyer, address, number of tiles, amount paid, and next to each entry a short line describing the use: chicken coop, pigsty, barn, porch, shed roof. On the last 3 entries, there was even a comment the customers themselves had made when she delivered the material, noted word for word. Arthur Jenkins received her in the meeting room, which she took as a sign. The gate this time had been the front one, and she hadn't waited in the parking lot. He had a different expression than the first time. Less condescending and more uncomfortable. She recognized that expression too. It was the look of someone who had been put in a situation they'd rather not be in and was trying to find an honorable way out. "Look, Mrs. Heather, here's the thing," he began. "I brought the record of all the sales," she interrupted, placing the notebook on the table. "Name, address, quantity, and destination of every piece that left here. If the steelworks needs any proof that the material was used responsibly, it's all here." Arthur looked at the notebook without touching it. "That's not exactly the problem," he said. "Then what is the problem?" He was silent for a second. "Someone made a complaint that the material could create liability for the company." "Who?" she asked directly. He didn't answer, But the silence was the answer. "Mr. Arthur," she said calmly, "the company gave me authorization to pick up material that was going to be discarded. I signed the receipt. The steelworks has no responsibility for what I do with it after it leaves here. That's already clear in the paper you yourself gave me." He looked at her. There was a certain tension there, but also, in the depths of his eyes, something she would only later recognize as acknowledgement, as if he were seeing something he hadn't expected to see in that room. "You're right," he finally said in a low voice. "The deal stands. But I need to warn you that from now on, you're going to have to manage without counting on me for anything beyond what's already agreed." "I've always been that way," she said. She picked up the notebook and left. Victor Vance, when he found out that the attempt to pressure the steelworks hadn't worked, changed his strategy. He was a man who rarely repeated a path that didn't work. He started working on reputation. The story that began to circulate around town was simple and devastating in its simplicity. The tiles Heather sold were dangerous. They rusted from the inside faster than they seemed to. The zinc was too old to withstand more than one heavy rain. An old man from another neighborhood had bought some, and the roof had given way in the first storm. None of this was verified, none confirmed, but the story was specific enough to sound true. And in the countryside, where information travels fast but not always carefully, a story that sounds true carries almost as much weight as one that is. Within 3 days, 2 buyers who had placed orders sent word cancelling. One was direct, said he'd heard comments and preferred not to risk it. The other sent a note without explanation, apologizing in a general way. A farmer named Barney, who had recommended Heather to his brother-in-law, called her with a sheepish voice. "Look, Heather, I feel awkward, but my brother-in-law got scared of the gossip. I know it ain't true, but he's stubborn." "It's okay, Barney," she said, not letting her voice tremble. "No problem." She hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for about 10 minutes without doing anything. From the next room, she could hear the soft sound of Chloe's notebook being turned. "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us folks just starting out. Now, moving on." The floor was shaking again. She knew that feeling. It was the feeling when the work you had built starts to unravel at the edges, and you don't yet know if you can hold the center together. She felt like calling someone, but when she thought about who to call, she couldn't find a name that made sense. Mrs. Gladys was for porch talk, not for this. Mr. George was for manual labor. Chloe was the daughter, not the mother, and Heather had a deep resistance to flipping that role. So she didn't call anyone. She grabbed the notebook, opened it to a blank page and started writing. Not names, not numbers. She wrote what she knew for sure, that the tiles were good, that she had tested them with her own weight, that the customers who received the material hadn't complained, that no roof had given way. She wrote each fact calmly, one under the other, like a list of solid things on ground that was trying to feel shaky. When she finished the list, she closed the notebook and went to sleep. And it was that week, 3 days after the cancellations, that Hank joined the farmers' WhatsApp group in the area with the photos. He had finished covering the chicken coop with her tiles. The photos showed the before, the chicken coop with a half-finished roof, exposed, with the wooden structure blackened by the rain, and the after, the new roof with the tiles fitted in regular rows, gleaming slightly in the sun. Hank wasn't a man of many words, and the message accompanying the photos had a straightforwardness that no paid ad could mimic. Reused tile. Bought it from Heather on the marketplace. Put it on 15 days ago. Held up through that rain last week with no problem. Anyone who wants her contact, send me a message. Heather's phone started getting messages that afternoon and didn't stop all weekend. She answered each one calmly and precisely. Quantity available, price per piece, delivery timeline. She wrote everything down in the notebook. By Sunday night, she had more orders than tiles available. It was a good problem to have. But it was a problem. The batch she had taken from the steelworks was almost gone. The remaining pieces were the most damaged. Some she was still deciding if they were worth the effort to restore. She called the steelworks early Monday morning and left a message asking if there was a schedule for new scrap. The response, via message, was that there was no material available at the moment. She sat on that for 2 days. Then she started searching. Her method was simple and direct. She knew that old rural warehouses and storage sheds were torn down fairly often when farms changed use or when the structures got too old to keep up. She went to talk to the farmers she knew, to the contractors who did demolitions in the area, to anyone who might know of a structure being taken apart, whose tiles would be discarded. On the 3rd day of this search, a man named Dusty, who did small jobs in the countryside, reached out to her via message. There was a warehouse on a farm about 7 miles from town that would be partially demolished to make way for a new structure. The owner, an older gentleman named Mr. Silas, had agreed to give up the old roof material in exchange for someone doing the removal at no cost. Dusty, who had no interest in the tiles but knew she did, had set it up. Heather went in person to Mr. Silas's farm on a Wednesday afternoon. The man was elderly, in his late 70s, with the slow gait of someone who had carried a lot of weight in his life, and the sharp look of someone who hadn't lost any of his precision over the years. "The young lady wants the tiles," he said, more as a statement than a question. "I do," she confirmed. "And you'll take it all off without damaging the rest of the structure?" "I'll hire someone who knows how," she said. "And the lady of the house can check on the work as it goes." He looked at her for a second. "There's one more thing," he said. "There are about 50 hardwood beams stuck in the roof. If you can get them out without breaking them, you can take them too." She hadn't expected the wood, but she didn't say that. She just said, "Leave it to me." The removal took 4 days and cost her an amount that used up part of what she had saved from her first sales. She hired 2 young men Dusty recommended, who were used to this kind of work, and she was there every day of the job, from early morning until sunset. Mr. George made the trips with the pickup truck, this time 2 trips a day because the volume was bigger. Chloe started showing up at the lot in the late afternoons, when she got back from school. She didn't announce that she was there to help. She arrived, watched for a few minutes, and then began organizing the tiles that came in without anyone asking. Heather didn't comment. She let it happen naturally, because she had learned that sometimes the best thing to do with someone who is coming back is not to make a fuss about the return. One afternoon, while the 2 of them were silently organizing a stack of tiles, Chloe said, without stopping what she was doing, "Tiffany texted me." Heather looked up. "And what did she say?" "She apologized, said she had been silly." "And you replied?" "I said I'd think about it," Chloe said. Heather was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes we really do need to think," she said carefully. Chloe nodded slightly and kept organizing the tiles. Heather felt something stir inside her, not exactly relief, but something that resembled it. It was that same week that she found on the kitchen table a notebook that wasn't hers. It was open to a page covered with a hand-drawn table with columns for customer name, neighborhood or location, number of tiles, price per piece, and total. Each line had the data from one of her customers, transferred from Heather's notebook into that new, more organized format. At the top of the page was written in round letters, "Orders, September." The handwriting was Chloe's. Heather stood still in the kitchen looking at that notebook for a long time. Not for the numbers, she already knew those, it was because of the handwriting. Chloe's handwriting looked a lot like that of Heather's father, a man who had taught his daughter that the world was hard, but that honest work always found a way. He had passed away too soon, and seeing that handwriting on those pages, with that care that was so familiar, caused something in Heather that she hadn't expected. She had to lean on the sink for a second. Then she folded the notebook back, placed it where she had found it, went to her room to shut herself in for 2 minutes, and returned to the kitchen to make dinner as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and she knew it. That same night, after dinner, while Chloe was in her room and Heather was washing the dishes, her cell phone rang. She saw the name on the screen and stood still, her hands wet with water and soap, staring at the lit screen. Craig. She let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th it stopped. She dried her hands on the dish towel, put her cell phone back on the counter and finished washing the dishes. It wasn't the first time he had tried to call. It had been the third time in 2 weeks. There was no message, just the missed call. But she knew, with that intuition 8 months had taught her to sharpen, that there was something different about these calls. It wasn't Craig who had left without looking back. It was Craig who had found out about something. Maybe the roofing tile deal, maybe the fair that was approaching, maybe just the passage of time that sometimes makes people look back. She didn't want that conversation. Not yet. Maybe never. But the name on her phone screen stayed with her all night like a small pebble in her shoe. Victor Vance's next blow came from where she least expected it, from the lot. It was a Friday at the end of the month when she received a note through the gate. It was from Mr. Henderson, the owner of the adjacent lot where she had stored the material. His handwriting was crooked like someone who rarely writes, but the message was clear. He had received a rental offer for the lot and needed her to clear everything out in 30 days. She didn't need much time to figure out who had made the offer. The amount Mr. Henderson mentioned in the note was 3 times what anyone would pay for that empty lot on a simple neighborhood street. There was no logical explanation other than someone was overpaying to solve a specific problem. 30 days. She spent that Friday night sleepless, calculating. The volume of material there wouldn't fit in the small space she had at home. She would need another place, and fast. She tried to mentally list the possibilities, rent a space, borrow one from someone, split the material across several locations to avoid concentrating it. Each option came with a cost or complication that made it difficult. It was at 3 in the morning that she remembered the shed. The shed at the back of her house had been closed for 8 months. It was about 40 square meters of space with brick walls and a roof compromised in 2 spots where rain got in. That's why she had closed it. She didn't want to deal with repairs while trying to handle everything else. But now everything else demanded exactly what she had been avoiding. The next morning, a Saturday, she opened the shed door for the first time since Craig had left. The smell that came from inside was of stagnant time and damp wood. There were old tools hanging on the wall, some he had left, some that were hers from before the marriage. There was a workbench he had set up years ago and never really used. There was a bucket with dried paint hanging on a nail, and there were 2 spots in the roof where outside light came through in thin threads, showing exactly where the problem was. She stood at the door for a long time, looking inside without entering. Then she went in. She spent 2 hours measuring, observing, calculating. The shed needed roof repairs. Ironically, it needed new tiles and a general cleaning. But the structure was solid. The walls were firm. It was a space that could become what she needed. The cost of the repairs was clear. She would have to use part of the roofing tiles she had set aside for sale. It was the hardest investment she had made since the beginning, not because the money was unrecoverable. The orders kept coming, and she knew she could replenish the stock. It was because there was something symbolic about using the tiles themselves to build the place where the business would grow. And there was something equally symbolic about opening that door. She made the decision in silence, alone in the shed, without telling anyone yet. On Monday, she talked to Dusty, the contractor, about what needed to be done. He came to take a look and said it would be about 10 days of work with 2 men, including replacing the roof and cleaning the floor. She negotiated the price, asked him to prioritize what was most urgent, and gave the go-ahead. Chloe found out when she saw Dusty and the 2 guys showing up on Tuesday morning with the tools. She opened her bedroom window, looked at the warehouse, then at her mother standing at the entrance, directing the men. In the afternoon, when she got home from school, she went straight to ask, "What are you doing with the warehouse?" "Fixing it up," Heather said. "Why?" "To have a place to store the materials. The lot next door is going to be vacated." Chloe was quiet for a second, processing. "And the tiles you're going to use?" "The ones I had set aside to sell." The girl didn't say anything right away. She stood watching the men work. "How much are you going to lose?" "It's not losing," Heather said carefully. "It's investing." Chloe looked at her. There was something on her daughter's face that Heather couldn't fully read. It wasn't suspicion. Maybe it was a kind of calculation, an attempt to understand. Then the girl went inside without saying another word. The renovation lasted 11 days, one more than Dusty had predicted, because the roof structure needed reinforcement at a spot that only became visible when the men got to the innermost parts. Heather went to her cleaning job and came back every morning and afternoon to check on progress, bring water and inspect the parts. Mr. George would stop by in the afternoon to lend a hand when he could, and Chloe started showing up on Saturday, without announcing herself, without asking if they needed help. She arrived with old gloves she'd found in a closet and began sweeping the warehouse floor while the men worked on the roof. Heather looked at her daughter for a moment and said nothing more than, "There's another broom in the corner." They worked side by side for almost 3 hours that Saturday. It was the longest time they had spent together doing the same thing since before Craig left, and there was a language in that shared work that words still hadn't found. On the last day of the renovation, when the men had left and the warehouse roof was closed and solid, Heather went inside and stood in the center of the empty space looking up at the tiles she herself had chosen. There was something complete about it, something she hadn't expected to feel, but it was there. She heard a noise at the entrance. Chloe was standing in the doorway with something in her hands. It was a small wooden plank from the leftovers of the renovation, with text written in black paint that had clearly come from some old can. The lettering wasn't even. It had the irregularity of someone who had never made a sign before. But it was readable. The girl had written the name of the business, a name she herself had chosen without asking permission, without warning. Heather read what was written. She stared at it for a while. She had to turn her face to the back of the warehouse for a second. "Where do you want to hang it?" she asked, her voice a bit lower than she intended. "At the entrance," Chloe said, and that was that. The sign was hung. The warehouse was ready. Mrs. Gladys came to see when she found out the next day. She stood in front of the warehouse with her hands clasped in front of her, looking at the structure with the expression of someone carefully evaluating something. "It turned out nice," she said. "It did," Heather agreed. "Did the girl pick the name?" "She did." Mrs. Gladys nodded as if that confirmed something she had already suspected. "She takes after her mother," she said. "She doesn't give up easily." Heather went inside the warehouse so she wouldn't be seen with what appeared on her face. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. That helps us a lot since we're just starting out. Now continuing. The move from Mr. Henderson's lot to the warehouse took 2 weekends, with help from Mr. George, Chloe, and a kid from down the street named Billy, who was 17 and full of energy, and whom Heather paid an agreed rate per day of work. In the end, the warehouse was organized in a way she had never managed on the open lot. Tiles, separated by condition, numbered in batches, with a label Chloe had made on each stack identifying the source of the material and the price per piece. While the warehouse was being finished, Victor Vance had made another move. He went back to the steelworks, this time not to pressure the manager through legal arguments, but to make a direct proposal, to buy, on an exclusive basis, all the scrap material the steelworks generated from then on. He offered to pay a symbolic amount for each batch, but guaranteed he would haul it all away at no cost and without red tape, which, from the steelworks' point of view, made practical sense that Heather couldn't easily argue against. Arthur Jenkins heard the proposal, and he stayed silent for a time that Vance interpreted as hesitation in his favor. But while he was silent, Arthur was remembering something. 6 years ago, maybe 7, time muddles things, his mother had gotten sick and needed to be hospitalized for nearly a month. Arthur had been so caught up in the situation that he'd neglected some license paperwork that needed to be renewed by the employer, and when he realized it, he was almost losing the employment status that allowed him his leave. He had panicked one afternoon, running between papers he couldn't organize and a deadline that was running out, and it was an employee of the supply cooperative where the company outsourced part of the warehouse who had helped him. A woman who knew paperwork, who had stayed after hours to arrange the papers in the right order, and who had explained step by step what needed to be done, without charging anything, without asking for anything in return. He had never connected that woman with the Heather who had shown up at the gate months ago asking for tiles. The hair was the same, but the context was so different that he hadn't made the connection. But now, hearing Vance speak with that confidence of someone about to close a deal, Arthur remembered. And he also remembered how he had felt that afternoon, relieved, grateful, and a little embarrassed that he had no way to repay what he had received. "I'll need to think about it," Arthur said to Vance. The man left with a smile that said he thought the answer would be yes. The answer was not yes. Arthur called Heather the next morning. She was in the warehouse reorganizing the stock when her cell phone rang and the Steelworks name appeared. She answered without knowing what to expect. "Mrs. Heather," he said, "I want to let you know that the next scrap batch is yours. You can count on it." She stood still with the phone to her ear for a second. "Why?" she asked. There was a short pause on the other end. "Because years ago you did me a favor I never repaid," he said. "And because I should have remembered that sooner." He hung up before she could respond. Heather stood in the warehouse with the phone in her hand and the silence around her. Then she called Chloe, who was at the entrance organizing a box of materials. "Come here," she said. Her daughter came. Heather showed her the phone with the call history open. "It was from the Steelworks," she explained. "They said the next batch is ours." Chloe read the word ours with her eyes, not her voice. Then she looked up at her mother. "Why did they change their minds?" she asked. "Because you never know when a gesture will come back around," Heather said. Chloe was quiet for a moment, taking that in. Then she went back to the box of materials without saying another word. But there was something different about her posture now, something Heather noticed and chose not to comment on so as not to scare her. It was that week that the invitation to the fair arrived. The rural business fair took place in the neighboring county, about 25 miles away, and was organized by the local town hall as a showcase of products and services geared toward the countryside. Heather hadn't even known the event existed until Hank himself called her one Wednesday afternoon. "Mrs. Heather, are you going to the fair?" he asked. "What fair?" she said, because she really didn't know. He explained, and then he revealed what he had done. He had entered her work into the showcase without telling her, sending photos of the renovated chicken coop and a handwritten account of what the roof tiles had meant to the rural community. He had received confirmation that the entry was accepted and that there was a spot available for an exhibition booth. "But I shouldn't have done that without asking, I know," he said, in a tone that mixed regret and anticipation. "But I figured you'd say no if I asked first." Heather was silent for a moment, then she said, "Hank, you're right that I would have said no. See? But since it's already done," she could hear his relief even over the phone. The truth was that the invitation had left her paralyzed in a way she hadn't expected. She had never presented herself as a producer of anything. She had never set up a booth, never exhibited any work. She had always been the assistant, the helper, the one who stayed in the background organizing what others decided. The idea of going to an event and saying, "This work is mine," had created a knot in her stomach that took her 2 days to start unraveling. But it was Chloe who didn't let her back out. The girl found out about the fair that same evening when Heather mentioned it hesitantly, and instead of staying quiet or giving a vague opinion, she went straight to the shed, started separating samples, pieces of tile in different stages of recovery, the before and after side by side, and said, without looking at her mother, "You're going to need a panel to show the photos. I'll make it." "Chloe, I didn't say I'm going." "You are," the girl said, just like that. And Heather, looking at her daughter's back, choosing samples with a determination she recognized as her own, reflected there, decided yes, she would go. On the morning of the fair, the two of them loaded the material into Mr. George's pickup truck, who had insisted on driving without anyone asking. Chloe had made a panel with cardstock glued onto a thin board, photos printed at the neighborhood print shop, showing the process of restoring the tiles, and under each photo a handwritten caption in the round lettering she inherited from whoever in the family. At the end of the panel, there was a sentence she had written without consulting anyone, "Discarded material that became a solution." Heather read that sentence in the truck on the way to the fair and said nothing, but her hand went to her daughter's shoulder for a second, quickly, before returning to her lap. The booth was set up by 8:30 in the morning. Mr. George went out for a walk and said he'd be back later. The two stayed there, Heather in her brown leather apron over her denim shirt, Chloe beside her with the order book in hand. The first visitors stopped out of curiosity. The panel drew attention. There was something different about that material that didn't follow the visual pattern of the other exhibitors, who had printed banners and embroidered uniforms. Heather's booth had a visual honesty that seemed to speak before words did. She answered questions calmly and precisely. She showed the samples, explained the process, gave the price. Chloe jotted down contacts. The line of interested people grew throughout the morning in a way neither of them had anticipated. It was in that line that Mrs. Gladys appeared. Heather took a second to understand what she was seeing. The woman had caught a ride into town that morning. She'd found out about the fair from the neighbors, taken a bus, walked over to the pavilion, and arrived at the booth with the straw bag she always used hanging from her arm, like someone who'd just been to the market. "I figured you all could use some backup," she said simply. And she stayed. She spent the morning beside them, talking to the older visitors, the ones who came in with suspicion or long stories about roofs they'd fixed other ways that hadn't worked out. Mrs. Gladys had a particular knack with that crowd. She knew how to listen without rushing, knew how to answer without urgency, and she carried a confidence that came from 67 years of experience with things that need to last. It was also her who saw Victor Vance walk into the pavilion. Mrs. Gladys recognized him right away. Everyone in town recognized Vance. She watched him circle among the booths with the stride of someone checking the size of a problem. When he got close to Heather's booth and stood there looking at the line of interested people and at Chloe's display board, Mrs. Gladys watched him with an expression that wasn't hostile, but wasn't exactly friendly either. Heather saw him from a distance. She kept her gaze steady, served the customer in front of her, jotted down the order, thanked them. When she looked again to where Vance had been, he was already gone. She took a deep breath and went back to work. At the end of the morning, when the flow had slowed a bit and Chloe had gone to get water for the three of them, Mrs. Gladys leaned against the booth next to Heather and said in a low voice, "I need to tell you something about Vance." Heather looked at her. "You know the supply cooperative closed a few months back," Mrs. Gladys said. "I know. I used to work there." "I know you did." The woman paused. "Do you know why it closed?" Heather didn't know. She'd gotten a notice, a sign on the gate, and then silence. The official story had been financial trouble, the same story you give when you don't want to give any more details. Mrs. Gladys told her what she knew. There was a businessman in the neighboring county who had made an offer to buy the cooperative months before it closed. The offer was turned down by the partners because the price was too low and because none of them wanted to see the cooperative turned into a private warehouse. That businessman then created difficulties, cancelled contracts, pressured suppliers. A rumor spread about the cooperative's financial stability that made some key partners pull away. With the partners gone, the funding dried up. And without funding, the cooperative closed. The businessman's name was Victor Vance. Heather listened to all of this with her hands clasped in front of her and a quiet expression. She didn't interrupt. She let Mrs. Gladys finish. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because one of the cooperative's partners is a cousin of my sister-in-law," Mrs. Gladys said, "and she told me everything when it happened. I kept it to myself because it wasn't the right time to speak, but now I figured it was." Heather was silent for a moment. The noise of the pavilion continued around them, conversations, footsteps, the sound of a presentation in another part of the space. She looked at the tiles in the booth, at the display board Chloe had made, at the order book her daughter had set on the table before going to get water. "He closed the cooperative," she said, not as a question, as a statement. "He closed the cooperative," Mrs. Gladys confirmed. Heather was silent for another moment. Then she said, "So he's the one who took my job." "He is," Mrs. Gladys said. "And now he's trying to take this place too." There was a heavy weight in those words. A weight that connected dots she had been trying to understand for months. The layoff that had come out of nowhere. The feeling that the ground had been swept from under her for no clear reason. The beginning of everything that followed. There was a name behind it all. A face. Her man she had seen that very morning pacing through the pavilion, with the step of someone assessing what needs to be eliminated. She could have been angry. And there was anger there. Of course there was. She knew its taste. But there was also something else, something it took her a second to identify. It was clarity. For the first time in months, the pieces were in place. She knew where the trouble had come from. She knew who had tried to destroy what she was building, and she knew, looking at that shed she had renovated with her own tiles, at the order book her daughter had organized, at the booth that was there with a line of interested customers, she knew she had survived. Not by luck, by hard work, by stubbornness, by a refusal to give up that was so ingrained in her that sometimes it was the only thing that kept her going when everything else didn't seem enough. Chloe came back with 3 glasses of water and found her mother and Mrs. Gladys in silence. She looked from one to the other. "What's up?" she asked. "Nothing," Heather said, and she took the glass of water. But Chloe knew her well enough to know it wasn't nothing, and well enough to know that sometimes the best thing is not to ask again. The most important moment of the fair happened in the early afternoon, when a tall, quiet man, wearing muddy boots like someone who had come from the fields and hadn't had time to clean them, stopped in front of the booth for a considerable time, examining each sample carefully. His name was Grant, and he owned 3 farms in the region, all with compromised roofing that he had put off repairing because of the cost. "What's the delivery time for a large lot?" he asked after a moment of silence. "It depends on the size of the lot," Heather said. He pulled a piece of paper from his shirt pocket. There were numbers written on it, quantities and measurements for each property. She looked, calculated in her head, consulted Chloe's book with the available lots. "For 3 staggered lots," she said, "I can start in 2 weeks and wrap up everything in 2 months." Grant stared at the paper for a second. "Do you guarantee the quality?" "I guarantee it with my name," she said. "If any piece has a problem within 6 months, I replace it at no cost." It was the biggest promise she had made since the start, but she made it firmly because she knew what was in those tiles. Grant extended his hand. "Deal," he said. When he left and the booth was momentarily without new visitors, Chloe looked at her mother with an expression Heather had been waiting to see for a long time. "You did it," she said quietly. Heather swallowed something that was in her throat. "We did it," she replied. Chloe looked away at the book, pretending to check the numbers. But Heather saw. She saw her daughter's face for a second before she lowered her head, and what she saw wasn't shame, nor that closed-off expression that had settled in months ago. It was something else, something Heather recognized because it was the same thing she had felt at the gate of the steelworks that Monday morning. It was pride. Mr. George was waiting outside when they left at the end of the afternoon, leaning against the side of the pickup truck with his hat in his hand and the smile he wore when he thought things had gone well. "So?" he asked. "So it went," Heather said. He nodded, satisfied, and went to help load the samples back in. On the way back to town, with the 3 of them squeezed into the front seat of the pickup and the sun setting on the passenger side window, Mrs. Gladys said, staring straight ahead, "You're going to need more material for that Grant contract." "I am," Heather agreed. "The lot from the steelworks is confirmed." "Good. So you'll manage." It was a statement, not a question. And Heather realized it was the first time someone had said that to her. Not as generic encouragement, not as words to cheer her on in a tough spot, but as an objective observation based on facts. You'll manage because the facts show you manage. She looked at the road ahead. "I will," she said. Victor Vance's last attempt came a week later. He had found out that Heather was getting some of her material from farms that were tearing down old structures. One of her suppliers, Jedediah, owner of a property with an old building set to be dismantled, received a visit from one of Vance's representatives with an offer to buy all the material from that demolition at a high price. An offer that came with the clear implication that if Jedediah sold to Vance, there would be future business. Jedediah was a man in his 50s who didn't have much patience for games he didn't understand. He turned down the offer that same afternoon, called Heather, and told her everything that had happened. "Why did you turn it down?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Because you did honest work with me and we had a deal," he said simply. She thanked him, hung up, and stood for a moment in the warehouse, alone, processing what she had heard. There was a lesson there that she didn't need to write in her notebook to remember, that what you build with honesty will, over time, find people who recognize it. Not always, not right away, and sometimes after a lot of stumbling, but it finds them. Vance didn't try again after that. Maybe he figured the attempts were costing more in effort than they were worth. Maybe he understood that what she had built wasn't fragile enough to be knocked down from the flanks he had chosen to attack. The town was still small, and Heather's name kept growing in it in a way that no longer depended on any gate, any permission, any favor. The contract with Grant was completed within the deadline she had promised. The 3 lots arrived on the agreed dates, the parts were installed by the contractors he hired, and 6 weeks later, the man showed up at Heather's warehouse with a box of cornbread muffins his wife had made. Because on the farm, when you close a good deal, you celebrate with food, he explained, with that same matter-of-factness that seemed to be the only language he used. She took the box, offered coffee, and the two of them chatted for a while about other properties he was thinking of renovating. It was a business conversation, but it was also a conversation between 2 people who had recognized each other as serious, and there was something pleasant about it that went beyond business. Craig called one more time on a Thursday afternoon. This time Heather was at the warehouse with Chloe when her cell phone rang. She saw the name, glanced at her daughter for a second, then picked up the phone and answered. "Craig," she said. "Heather." His voice was different, quieter. "I just wanted to know how you all are doing." She was silent for a moment, looking around the warehouse, the organized stacks of tiles, Chloe's labels, the sign at the entrance. "We're doing fine," she said, and there was a firmness in those 2 words that was very different from the person he had left 8 months earlier. He was silent on the other end for a second. "I heard you've got a business going," he said. "I do. I'm glad to hear that." "Thank you," she said. "Take care, Craig." And she hung up. Chloe had stopped writing when the call started and was still frozen when it ended. She didn't ask anything. Heather didn't explain anything. But in the silence between them, this time, there was a different quality. It wasn't the silence of distance. It was the silence of 2 people who understand the same thing at the same time and don't need to put it into words. Heather put her phone in her apron pocket and went back to what she was doing. On a Saturday morning, a few weeks later, as the 2 were organizing a batch that had just arrived, Mr. George appeared at the warehouse gate with his hat in hand and an expression unlike his usual one. It wasn't joy, it wasn't sadness. It was that expression of someone about to receive something they didn't expect. Heather had set aside a whole batch of roofing tiles for him, enough to cover the entire roof of his house, which had needed repairs for 2 years, but which he always put off because the money he had was too little for it. He looked at the tiles, then at her. "Heather," he said. "You lent the truck without asking for anything," she said. "And I know the pot roast with carrots lunch didn't cover the cost." He was quiet for a time that felt long. Then he said, his voice a little rough, "I didn't help you expecting anything in return." "I know," she said. "That's why you deserve it." Mr. George kept looking at the tiles for a moment longer. Then he put his hat on his head, nodded once and left without another word. But when he reached the gate, he stopped and turned back. "The pot roast with carrots lunches can still keep coming," he said. She laughed, and that laugh came out with all the lightness of someone who is finally beginning to feel light. It was on an ordinary morning, with no special date, nothing to set it apart from all the mornings that had come before, that Chloe showed up at the warehouse before her mother arrived. When Heather walked in with her apron already tied and her blonde hair pinned up, she found her daughter checking the labels on the stacks with an attention she recognized as the same attention she herself put into her own work. "You're early," Heather said. "I wanted to ask you something," Chloe said, without taking her eyes off the labels. "Ask away." The girl stopped, turned around. "Can you teach me how to negotiate with the suppliers?" Heather stood still for a second. Then she set the stack of papers she was holding on the counter and looked at her daughter. At that face that had been closed for so long and was now open, not in a way that gave everything away at once, but in a way that showed there was something genuine behind it. "I can," she said. Chloe nodded and went back to the labels as if it was simple, as if it weren't also the beginning of something. Heather stood still for another second, watching her daughter. Then she started working too, side by side in the warehouse that had come from a decision made at 3 in the morning with the floor threatening to cave in the warehouse that had been patched up with the very tiles it sold, in the warehouse that her daughter had christened with a sign made of old paint on a small plank. Outside, through the gap in the open door, the morning sun was coming in just enough to illuminate the stacks of tiles from the front, those sheets of zinc that had been discarded as trash, transformed through work and patience and refusal, and that now represented, with all the solidity of metal, what a woman can build when she decides she won't depend on anyone else to build it. Tile by tile, day by day, with her own hands. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this story. Leave your comments saying where you're watching us from. Don't forget to hit like and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.